The Lizard King. That's the self-proclaimed title Jim Morrison identified with when on stage. Jim Morrison of the Doors is a household name. Most people know that he was a famous, rebellious musician. More than his record sales and success, I'd like to explore more about him. How did he go from the dutiful child who excelled at school to the outrageous poster child for rebellion and resistance? What events led to his persona, and how did he impact the world as we know it today? James Douglas Morrison was born in Melbourne, Florida on December 8, 1943 to Clara Clark Morrison and his father, George Stephen Morrison. His father was a commander of the USS Naval Forces during the Vietnam War and was in command of the aircraft carrier, the USS Bonham Richard. Jim Morrison was an exceptional student and loved to read and write. His sister says that he would learn a new vocabulary word, then write a whole poem or story around it. Because of this, he had an immense vocabulary. He also excelled at sports and swimming. He went through a traumatic experience as a child, which would eventually play a big part in his music and life and shape his onstage persona. He and his family were driving down Desert Road in New Mexico when they came upon the site of a grisly, bloody accident involving a truck with Native American workers. There were multiple mangled bodies strewn about the highway, and the experience was so intense that he said that it was the first time he could taste fear and feel everyone's energy. He also recollected feeling like the spirits of the dead Native Americans were running around freaking out and that two jumped into his body. He claims to have carried these spirits his entire life, and you can see the influence of this vivid experience that he had in his performances. He also references this in his songs Peace Frog and Ghost Song.
Indians scattered on dawn's highway bleeding, ghosts crowd the young child's fragile egg.
This line was in both of the songs and literally speaks of that incident. He also later, among philosopher, poet, and rock star, also considered himself a shaman of sorts. He seemed to be able to take experiences and strip them down to their spiritual core, which he then turned into poetry. So we know he came from a strict military household with rigid rules, and that he was a dutiful student who excelled at everything. He actually had an IQ of about 150. Throughout his childhood, his family had a nomadic lifestyle because of his father's career in the Navy. He moved from Florida to California to Virginia, back to Florida, then to California again. As he grew older, he displayed signs of rebellious behavior. In class, he actually told the teacher that he was going to have a tumor removed and just walked out of class just to go read. He did well, though, and graduated from high school in Virginia. We also know that he was a keen poet and voracious reader and writer. He really took an interest in Nietzsche, and for his high school graduation gift, he asked for the complete works of Friedrich Nietzsche and got it. There is one quote from The Birth of a Tragedy that particularly stands out, which is, "Though the favorite of the gods die young, they also live eternally in the company of the gods." It's almost like Jim Morrison read that and lived his life accordingly. He also read Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley was a philosopher and novelist and is best known for writing the dystopian novel Brave New World. He studied the effects of mescaline on human perception by actually doing it. Mescaline is the active ingredient in peyote, which Jim Morrison also partook in. Interestingly, Aldous Huxley first heard about peyote at a Native American church in New Mexico. He hoped drugs would help him find the boundaries between the ego and the spirit to draw him closer to the spiritual enlightenment and to also satisfy his quest as a seeker of knowledge. Aldous Huxley wrote the book The Doors of Perception, which reflected his experiences. Similarly, Jim Morrison thought of himself as a philosopher and the seeker of knowledge and truth. His goal was to help people break through to a bigger reality and see the world as he did. It was from Aldous Huxley's book, in fact, that the name The Doors was taken. As Jim Morrison quoted, "There are things unknown and there are things known, and in between are the doors." After he graduated from high school, his father was restationed to California, so he went to go live with his grandparents in Clearwater, Florida. He attended St. Petersburg Junior College. He continued his defiance to authority and constriction. and began to drink and party even more. His grandparents didn't drink, so he would leave beer bottles lying around just to annoy them. He began attending FSU and made the dean's list his freshman year. This is when he realized his passion for film, and the college tutor suggested that he go into film, so he packed up and left for UCLA. Then at UCLA, he found himself losing interest in film and developed an interest in poetry. In fact, the only thing keeping him in school was the fact that he wanted to avoid being drafted into the military. About being drafted, he said, "I didn't want to go into the army, and I didn't want to work, and that's the damn truth." He represented everything that his father wasn't. His father was strict, rigid, and orderly, while he was the opposite, wild-spirited and defiant. He was one of the revolutionaries who spurred the hippie rock movement, and his unwillingness to conform to his father's metric and any other authority made him who he was, but would eventually be his demise in the end. I find it so ironic that Jim was a staunch anti-war person, but his father was in a pivotal position during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which basically caused us to enter into the Vietnam War. I wonder if he ever realized how big of an impact his family had on the history and future of our nation as we know it today. Around this time, a new scene of artists began gathering in a small suburb by Venice Beach called Laurel Canyon. Jim Morrison was one of the first of this new wave of hippies, musicians, and other creative minds to arrive there. These influential artists were all ahead of their time and remembered until this day. Frank Zappa, the Byrds, the Eagles, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin are just a few of them. What drew them there of all places? Some people say that it was because of the cheap real estate. There you could actually rent an apartment for in the 200s. I still think it is interesting that these artists who would shape the youth of their generation all congregated to this little town in California. A lot of them also came from influential career military families. While in Venice Beach, California, being the young poet he was reading poetry and ran into Ray Manzarek, who attended UCLA as well. Ray became intrigued by Jim's lyrics. They got along, and eventually he and Morrison were the first founding members of the Doors. Ray was a keyboardist. John Densmore was a drummer who joined quickly after they founded their group. Densmore suggested that they let Robbie Krieger audition as a guitarist, and he earned the spot right away. And the Doors were created. With all their expertise put together, they turned out a really innovative sound. Jim Morrison had his lyrical baritone raw style. Krieger brought his classical mixed with Spanish flamenco guitar. They didn't really have a bass player, so Manzarek improvised the bass sound with his state-of-the-art Fender Rhodes electric piano. In 1967, they were signed on to Elektra Records. Shortly after, they became much more noticed, and his life would become a tragic, intriguing whirlwind of experiences. His song Light My Fire shot to #1 in July of 1967. In September of that year, the group was invited to The Ed Sullivan Show. This was a popular chat show which usually featured celebrities and musical groups like Elvis and the Beatles. He was supposed to change some of the lyrics to the song Light My Fire as they referenced getting high and taking drugs. He promised them that he would change the lyrics, but went ahead and sang the original lyrics anyway. Ed Sullivan was so upset that not only did he not shake Jim Morrison's hand, but vowed that they would never return to a show again and promptly canceled their next 6 scheduled appearances, to which Jim Morrison replied, true to his rebellious attitude, "We just did the Ed Sullivan Show." During this time, despite being really successful, he became more and more dependent on drugs and started displaying erratic behavior even at his performances. Nevertheless, he went on to record more brilliant songs and always delivered a powerful performance. In 1968, he recorded an album called Waiting for the Sun. One of his songs was Celebration of the Lizard, in which he says, "I am the Lizard King and I can do anything." He took the persona of the Lizard King, which became his onstage alter ego. He alluded also to being the king of other things as well, like the Snake King. Recently, a newly discovered fossil of an extinct reptile named Barbaturix morrisoni was named in honor of Jim Morrison. His song People Are Strange from the album Strange Days rose up to the top 10. It was featured in the cult classic The Lost Boys. He was deeply depressed one day and went to visit his band members Densmore and Krieger, who were roommates at the time. Krieger convinced Morrison to go for a walk along Laurel Canyon. He climbed to the top, and like a strike of lightning, he was inspired to write the song. The words came to him, and he excitedly wrote them down. This song really showed his vulnerability and being an outsider. Maybe he was trying to describe how he felt in this world and not really being understood. He really was way ahead of his time, and there were few people who could grasp his transcendent level of thinking. The End was another extended concept song, which was almost 12 minutes long. Originally, it started off as a goodbye song to an ex, but evolved to have multiple meanings. The song concept is universal, so you can interpret it to take away whatever you want from it. He said that sometimes it could even mean the end of his youth. He wanted to do a whole side of record, which included several other extended version songs, but the record label declined his idea. He became more rebellious after this and resistant to the requests of both the record label and his audience. He was just sick and tired of singing Light My Fire and didn't want to sing it, although it was in demand. The freedom that he had expected from being an artist and poet was no longer there, and he wanted people to take him seriously. Morrison wanted to share his poetic dream worlds, and he said that poetry is very close to music, and that music's hypnotic quality puts the poet in the right state of mind, leaving him free to allow his subconscious to play itself out wherever it goes. He released a couple more records that weren't so well received. He just couldn't make everyone happy. His drug use became even more rampant, and he started smoking marijuana, took LSD and peyote, and probably did every drug and hallucinogen except for heroin. Despite his nearly constant intoxication and drunkenness, he was still endlessly able to pull himself together and deliver riveting, passionate shows. Of course, the partying and drinking took its toll, and gone was a young Dionysus that we all knew. He gained 20 pounds, stopped wearing the iconic leather jeans, and grew a beard. Being intoxicated most of the time, he did get in a lot of trouble with the law, and even caused riots when appearing in some places. Some examples of his wild antics are, in 1967, before his New Haven Arena performance, he was caught in a compromising position in a shower stall with a girl by the police. They told him to beat it, and he told them to eat it, which progressed to him being promptly maced. After recovering, he performed a show, but decided to retell the story to the audience, but laced with profanities and belittling the police department. So he was arrested and booked for indecency and public obscenity. Also, at the Dinner Key Auditorium, there was an arena which held 7,000 seats. These seats were removed to increase sales to 12,000 seats. He was really intoxicated and delivered a pretty weak performance. His audience lost patience, then someone jumped up on the stage and poured their champagne on him, which caused him to take off his shirt and tell his audience that it was time to see some skin. They then proceeded to start undressing. He was arrested for exposing himself as well as shouting obscenities to the crowd. He was charged and convicted but died before it was legally resolved, and his band members also denied him exposing himself. Also, in the Boston arena, he was falling down drunk, and the first thing he did when entering the stage was to use his microphone stand to try to tear apart the stage. Another instance, when which he was totally obliterated, he was trying to climb up some amps on the stage. He lost his footing and fell back onto the stage, flat on his back, and continued to sing to the crowd's approval. However, this incident caused another venue in Utah to ultimately cancel their show. Not much later, all of his partying and drug abuse came to a head. He had so much to say, but it seemed like no one was really ready to listen. He was so ahead of his time that his brilliance was seen as insanity, like the geniuses of the past. He moved to Paris, France, probably to get away from the scrutinizing public and confining rules of the record companies, get his mind straight. He never really wanted anything to do with fame in the beginning anyway. He also wanted to concentrate on reading and writing again, but tragically he died in Paris, France in 1971 at the young age of 27. His girlfriend, Pamela Corson, died not much later. She was also 27. Like many great influential people, Jim Morrison was an intense light that burned out way too quickly. He chose to live, as Nietzsche said, one who does not negate. He lived his life to the fullest for what he believed in with an all-or-nothing attitude and wanted to shock people out of their mind's comfortable complacency and liberate them. He was such a force that he didn't even have to try. People followed him because of his charisma and free spirit, and that appealed to them. He was brilliant, daring, and driven, and there is no doubt that he had a large influence on the young adults of his generation and beyond. His father said that he had high moral and ethical standards and lived by them, earning the title of rock legend, whose name and energy will live on forever.